So Peter was born in England and was educated there and in Ireland. He immigrated to Canada in 1967 and taught elementary and high school in Grey and Bruce counties. He and his wife, Jean, retired to Kingston in the year 2000, where he had been able to continue his explorations into local history. He published a book, Kingston in 150 Pictures, in 2017, and has involved himself in a wide range of volunteer activities in the area, including, many people will know, he's chair of the formidable Heritage Kingston Committee. I also want to mention that Peter was also very actively involved in researching the names that went on the memorial wall at Memorial Center. So, for someone who's only lived here since year 2000, Peter has certainly made an impact on the community. So welcome, Peter. I turn the floor, as they say, over to you. And
hello.
Is Peter there? Peter, can you hear me?
He's on mute.
Okay, better now.
There, thank you.
Good. Firstly, for those of you who don't want the pictures down the right-hand side of the participants, if you put your cursor on those pictures and go up to the top, you'll see a little bar. And if you click on that bar, all the pictures disappear and you get the full screen. So, ever since the first cave family outgrew their first cave, the question has been, just what do you do when a perfectly usable building can no longer be used for the purpose for which it was built, or when that purpose becomes redundant or outdated? Because invested in that building is a large number of resources: quarried stone, manufactured brick, carefully chosen and seasoned wood, and hundreds of hours of labor by architects and workers. And the answer used to be simple: tear it down, that's on the left, and build something new on the right. But more and more, our thinking is changing, and what once would be declared surplus and useless is now seen as able to be adapted to a new use. So today, I'll look at some of those adaptations, some very successful, some very expensive, and some, shall we say, not so successful. And let's start with two very recent and probable failures and one possibility. The Preston Springs Hotel in Kitchener, up on the top left, was not in the greatest shape, but there were plans for adaptations. Despite an injunction by local heritage groups, it was demolished over New Year's holiday. In Toronto, the former Dominion Foundry, a complex of 4 buildings, is part of the West Don Lands. And dating from 1917, the 4 buildings were deemed historically and architecturally significant as a good example of an industrial enclave in the area adjoining the Lower Don River. They were added to the city's heritage register in 2004, and the city had planned to repurpose the buildings. The province issued a ministerial zoning order. This is one of these new things which strips the City of Toronto of any planning or demolition control in favor of the province's plan to redevelop. There doesn't seem to be any known development plan to replace the expected repurposing of the buildings on the site, so down they will probably come. The Toronto Star has been particularly eloquent in its complaining. On Saturday's paper, the 2 headlines: "What's the hurry to destroy the Foundry site?" and also "Demolition paused as a good faith measure," whatever that means. And the Globe and Mail has recently picked up on the possibility of the demolition or adaptation of the Rogers Centre. Architect Kelly Doran notes that it has 55,000 tons of carbon baked in it. The 137,000 cubic meters of concrete and 7,000 tons of steel created large volumes of carbon dioxide. So do we just pull it down and build something new? The construction of new buildings makes up about 11% of global emissions. Should Rogers be allowed to demolish and rebuild, or should they adapt? So let's leave buildings for a moment and visit social institutions, which should be easier to change. Let's think of what we do when we realize that something we have lived with all our lives is no longer as useful as it once was. When I first came to live in a small Western Ontario town in 1967, I found there were two places where I was not invited: the Masonic Lodge and the Legion Hall. Both had practical origins, both had seen better times, and both had very restricted membership. Of the two, I was first allowed inside the lodge and have watched as these comradely groups have barely survived over the years while becoming a little more open. Oddfellows and Rebeccas, as you see at the top, actually meet and work together now. And similarly, today, the Legion welcomes all. The Legion then was a closed group. It had come into existence in the 1920s as a place of refuge for the many soldiers returning from the battlefields, suffering from what now we would diagnose as serious PTSD. The Kingston group, for instance, met in the armories, took their beer into a room and locked the door, and the others knew not to disturb them until they unlocked their door. By 1960, Legion numbers were rapidly decreasing, and the vets were mostly in their 70s. Second World War vets had not been inclined to join. They'd not been through the same traumatic experience, and the new suburbs and higher standard of living helped them recover more easily. The Legions owned much real estate and were often the only licensed premises in a rural area, but they were literally dying out. But some members saw the need for them, and they revised the rules and the procedures. And now membership is open to just about anybody who did not fight against Canada. Today, the Legion raises hundreds of thousands of dollars for charitable work. In one issue of the Legion magazine, and there are 6 issues a year, $215,000 is recognized. The Legion runs a Remembrance Day poem and poster contest for school children, with the winning entries now exhibited for the year in the War Museum in Ottawa. It runs a national track and field meet for youth. And some branches, once fiercely independent, have now actually combined. What a difference a few outstanding visionaries have made to an organization that was on life support. So perhaps it's visionaries we're looking for. Kingston, we must remember, has done very well in retaining older buildings, continuing to use the natural resources, but adapting the building to a new purpose. Here we have Charles Hale's store from 1840, City Hall, the Commercial Bank, and the Bank of Montreal, and you can probably name others. Elsewhere, and many of my examples will be from Europe, we find that adaptations can be made. This is a London example. In 1743, l'Église Neuve was built by the Huguenots in Spitalfields, East London. They were Protestant refugees from France, and by 1800, they had prospered as weavers and moved on. The building was taken over by the London Society, an evangelical group concerned with converting the Jews to Christianity. And they converted 16 before selling the building to the Methodists, who by 1870 had, somewhat ironically, sold it to the Marzike Hadath community. And the building became the Spitalfields Great Synagogue. In 1912, some 30,000 people crowded the streets for the funeral of the rabbi. But many of the Jewish houses and businesses were destroyed during the London Blitz, and the Jewish population moved on, selling the building, now in its 5th life and 3rd religion, to the Bangladesh community, who opened the 3,200-seat Jam Masjid Mosque. Same building, same bricks and mortar, with conservation of resources and energy, because an older building, no longer serving its original purpose, was adapted for a new use. We can find similar examples all over. A surplus church, now 27 apartments. St. Mark's, a Grade 1 listed building in Mayfair, London, England, built in 1825 with one of the finest facades in the city. Between 1950 and 1975, the congregation dwindled and it was declared redundant. It was used for 30 years by various outreach groups, but now has been repurposed as a retail and dining destination. The portico, chancel, windows, bell tower, and crypt have all been restored. In Chaplow, Ontario, a 110-year-old church was scheduled to be demolished, but it was saved by over 550 volunteers to become the host of a concert and theatre series with rotating displays of art and historic artifacts. The chapel is leased back to the congregation for worship. And projects don't have to be big. A rural Peterborough County church will become somebody's rural hideaway with quiet surroundings. Now, let's be careful with this one. Claybury Hospital was a psychiatric hospital in Woodford Bridge, London. The site was situated on the brow of a hill, surrounded by 50 acres of ancient woodland, 95 acres of open parkland, ponds, pasture, and historic gardens. Think Rockwood, but on a larger scale. It closed in 1997, and the public looked forward to access to those grounds. But it was bought for development and has become a gated village for the rich, renamed Repton Park. Before its closure, the Catholic chapel, seen here probably when it was first built in 1893, was declared by the government a Grade 2 listed building. Now, the chapel is a swimming pool, though I presume the outside of the building is unaltered, so this could be allowed in Kingston. The confessionals are the saunas, and above it is an exercise room for the very rich local residents. Just think what we could do with the Rockwood estate. And this, Hagia Sophia, a Greek Orthodox cathedral in Constantinople, built in 537, the largest church in Christianity for 983 years. Larger, it is claimed, than was Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. It survived until 1453, when the Roman Empire finally fell to the Ottomans, who converted it into a mosque. Another 478 years later, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, to be replaced by a secular government. Hagia Sophia became a museum in a 1483-year-old building. And just recently, 96 years later, it was converted back to a mosque. Fourth life, same bricks, same mortar. Now, 30 years ago, the thought of repurposing a heritage building was very rare. Today, we realize it is part of a greener world. So on the left, we see a request for expression of interest, a unique opportunity to restore and/or the adaptive reuse of a historical site, the Port Hope Opera House in the downtown heritage district of Port Hope. Unfortunately, that was some time ago, so it's too late if anybody has ideas there. But on the right, St. Andrew's downtown church reviewing ideas to repurpose the historic manse for the homeless. Let's go back to Spitalfields. This is the other end of Fournier Street. You can see the minaret of the mosque in the distance. The houses were the Huguenots' homes with large windows on the top story to throw light onto their weaving. And we're standing between Christchurch and the 10 Bells, both 18th century buildings. The 10 Bells was the drinking place of several of Jack the Ripper's victims and probably of Jack himself. So this is not a special upper class area. But on the other side of the street is Christchurch, a Nicholas Hawksmoor church dating from 1729. And an early 19th century drawing and a recent photograph show how little the exterior has changed. There was an interior fire in 1836, and in 1866, the interior was totally changed to suit Victorian fashions. By 1960, the building was falling into disrepair, the roof was leaking, and services were stopped. But in 1976, the Friends of Christchurch started to demolish the Victorian interior improvements and to reinstate Hawksmoor's design. A surplus local church was sold to start the fundraising. And amazingly, Hawksmoor's original plans and detailed building accounts were found and followed by this dedicated group of artisans. This is the end result. I asked about the seating. Oh, that was just for last night. We'll clear it for the Bangladesh dance on Saturday and decide on the Sunday seating after that. And an even more historic building. St. Stephen Walbrook was built before 1100, rebuilt in 1430, destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. Over the road lived one of its parishioners, a young lad called Christopher Wren, who was hired to rebuild it. And he used this as practice for his craftsmen and for his ideas about how St. Paul's Dome would be supported inside the building. But all was not well. The Walbrook in the church's name is a river which runs underneath the church, and it was slowly subsiding and collapsing. It was damaged, as you see in the center, in the 1941 London Blitz. Its congregation was seriously declining as people no longer wanted to live in central London. And so the difficult decision was made. Over 10 years, it was stabilized by a reinforced concrete ring through the walls. The additions not made by Wren were removed, and a huge circular slab of marble from the quarry used by Michelangelo and designed by Henry Moore was placed in the center of the church for the altar. Benches surround it, and it has become a most popular lunchtime recital center. You can no longer walk straight from the west entrance to the altar, but you feel that Wren, forever controversial and daring in his innovations, would be quite pleased. Another successful adaptation, which almost certainly prevented another demolition by more visionaries. But even small changes can make a difference. The church I attended as a preteen in London, England is another interesting, if less dramatic, success story. It is a huge, one might say ugly, Victorian brick building. The spire never was built. When I attended, it was packed with 400 or 500 each Sunday morning. Over the years, that number dropped to 10, and 3 parishes were combined. Now, the back 10 rows of chairs have been replaced by a cafe-style area where people can sit and meet after the service. The north aisle has a washroom and an unsupervised children's play area, facilities used during the service, both unthinkable 60 years ago. And this is without the church changing its basic beliefs or practices. And they again have a very viable congregation. A change. In 20th century England, public lavatories were a common sight, necessary because so few lower class houses had running water, but shared an outdoor pump and toilet. They were usually discreet, often under the sidewalk. They were fenced with wrought iron and tiled for easy cleaning. And for a number of reasons, they were slowly closed and often just abandoned. But enterprising entrepreneurs have found new uses. Here we see 3 adaptations: a coffee bar, a bar, and a nightclub. Inside the coffee bar, the attendant. And this one has become a home. Now, the adaptation of industrial buildings can be much more challenging. In Kingston, I believe we simply demolished the Canadian Locomotive Company without thinking what could have been done with it. When the Swindon railway works closed in 1986, 5,000 were put out of work. It once employed 14,000, and a huge area of the town was about to be left derelict, and many families had generations of memories enshrined there. While not all was saved, the original core infrastructure now has listed building status. One building currently houses the Swindon Steam Railway Museum. The engineer's office is now the headquarters of English Heritage, and many of the remaining buildings were redeveloped as part of a designer outlet village. Much of the heavy equipment, as you see here, was simply left in the roof, and many stores have signs stating what once happened on the site where they now are. And when you have your coffee at Costa's, you sit in the shadow of a real steam locomotive built right here. And the children's daycare ride is, of course, on a train. And again, notice the huge hook in the ceiling. And sometimes you have to be daring. This is Poperinge, Belgium in 2006, 4 years later. Mind you, it isn't always easy, not that that Poperinge building was easy either. And sometimes I wonder if it is financially worthwhile. Battersea Power Station in South London is a splendid building designed by Sir Gilbert Scott, who also designed Liverpool Anglican Cathedral, the new Bodleian Library in Oxford, and the Red British Phone Box. It's a Grade 2 star building. One side was opened in 1935. The other side, delayed by the war, started operating in 1956. But it was coal-fired and soon became outdated. Station A was closed in 1976, Station B in 1983, and for 30 years, its future was debated. Here it is as a working power station on the side of the River Thames, part of an industrial complex. And about the same time it was closed, its partner, the Bankside Power Station, half the size and a few miles east, was also closed and converted into the Tate Modern Art Gallery. Now, Wikipedia has a long detailing of what was planned and changed, and it's well worth reading to see the ups and downs. The first plan for an indoor children's theme park was soon abandoned. And it was even going to become a sports stadium, home of Premier Soccer League's Chelsea. I'm sorry about the quality of this image, but I still think it was a wonderful proposal. The plan approved on the right and completed now almost is for bars, restaurants, Apple offices, and 250 residential units. Development is nearing completion, and this is the old and the adapted. The problem is that when you look at what is surrounding the building now, extremely expensive apartments, we're talking about £10 million apartments, and you can hardly see the power station except from the river. Now, two tests. What would you do in this situation? We have an abandoned castle. For 7 centuries, the Macclesfield family has inhabited Sherborne Castle in Oxfordshire. Now it stands empty following the eviction of the 9th Earl of Macclesfield. The court order was initiated by his relatives following a family dispute begun by the will of the 7th Earl, who, in order to avoid death duties, placed the estate in a company and divided the shares among his relatives. The evicted Earl holds only a small percentage of the shares, and for 30 years he has been struggling to maintain his hold on the estate. The future of the castle, built when French invasions threatened the country in the 14th century, is uncertain. So just what can you do to keep and maintain a building like that? And here is the General Post Office in Hong Kong. opened in 1976, when it was predicted to be as much of a landmark as its Victorian predecessor, which presumably was demolished. Now it's up for sale. Should its new owner be allowed to demolish it? Because then would go another part of colonial history. Note the larger windows on this floor where the white customers completed their business, and the smaller windows on the upper floor where the local workers did theirs. Or will the Chinese government, likely the future owners, demolish it and build an exemplar benchmark skyscraper on this land-hungry island? Well, have you been thinking how Kingston is doing? A brewery became a military hospital, became an arts centre. 171 Brock is refurbished and returned to much like its original. Plans for the prison for women suggest that the exterior will be maintained and the Spartan interior repurposed. What will happen to Kingston Penitentiary? But so-called white elephant buildings can be demolished, as we saw at the beginning with Plymouth Square. Here was 86 Brock Street, probably Kingston's oldest surviving frame building, but it was in the way for development on Clarence, and so it was demolished. The development, as you can see here, never happened. They can be abandoned, like the registry office seems to have been, because their owners can find no use for them, or they can be adapted in ways never contemplated by their original designers. But it isn't always easy. Can you rebuild this up on the top left using the original stone into something like what is on the other side of Princess Street? And in doing that, can you be authentic? And always remember Craig Sims' dictum. My grandfather brought his axe with him from Ireland 200 years ago. We treasure it. It's had the blade replaced 3 times and the handle twice. Is it still a heritage act? Surprisingly, chain restaurants have often been the best at adapting, often by simply adding their distinctive logos. Both Pizza Pizza and Jack Astor's have a worldwide reputation for good adaptations of old buildings. And here we have the A&W, Starbucks, and Circle K. Now, most people do not like the addition of logos, but I believe that they are better than the complete change of a heritage front and intrusion into the streetscape, as has been requested down here by McDonald's for a new McDonald's at Princess and Clergy, replacing the Tim Hortons, but not yet approved. And such adaptations today have to allow access for all, which can be difficult. The Market Square A&W did it discreetly with some objections by making a hole in the wall here in the stonework here and making an accessible entrance. Queens has some masterful ones. Gordon Hall, where the main entrance quite simply was moved down to street level. And this has been followed elsewhere. And Ontario Hall shows you the difficulties. The so-called street level is down the stairs. This entrance is even more impossible. Douglas Hall now has an accessible entrance, but boy, they really point out that you're not allowed to go through that door anymore. And far away in North Wales, an interesting difficulty. Carnarvon Castle was built to keep people out, not want them to come in. The moat and the walls are, unsurprisingly, not accessibility friendly. I believe that it was for the 1911 investiture of the Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, that this staircase was added. But only recently has the wheelchair ramp here been added. And I had to use the Google Street Shot because the ramp does not appear anywhere in the guidebook. So you can adapt, even in extreme cases, even if it takes away the point of the inaccessibility and seems to be embarrassing to the authorities. And if we cannot adapt, we can always move the building. Heritage was in the way of the new Stauffer Library at Queen's, so 3 houses were moved. But now we have city houses in a rural landscape, and this again brings up the question of authenticity. Or if we're in Markham, we can move the building into a heritage subdivision. Again, the building is saved, but the authenticity is lost. I love the comment, heritage estates is a sanctuary of last resort for threatened historic homes. But then, how authentic are our living museums and our zoos? Are you really experiencing 19th century rural or urban life, or life with elephants? Fun, entertaining, and educational as they may be, they're not the real thing. But adaptations can be done. A gas holder, now with an apartment building inside. A school, becoming an apartment complex with almost no changing in that situation. The Dickensian workhouse becomes a medical complex, and in fact there's a lot of medical buildings behind that area as well. It's a large medical area. And graveyards, which have become small parks in urban areas. So let's lastly look at 4 success stories. The first involves adapting the neighborhood to accommodate the heritage building. And I emphasize, and I'll repeat that, adapting the neighborhood. I spent much of my childhood in Croydon, now part of Greater London. In 1596, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, founded the Hospital of the Holy Trinity, now known as the Whitgift Almshouses, and he built them near his summer palace, now repurposed as a school, and across the road from a 14th century hostelry. It was an unfortunate place to build because it was right on the direct route from Westminster, 10 miles north, to Brighton, 40 miles south, and the closest resort south of London, closest sea resort south of London. In the early 19th century, Brighton became the social place to be, with the Prince Regent building his royal pavilion there, and all the traffic had to squeeze between the hostelry and the almshouses. Now, still in 1900, the traffic was not too bad, but as cars and omnibuses increased, congestion also increased, turning the corner became difficult. The building, in fact, protrudes into both the western and southern streets, as you'll see better later on. The road system, when formalized, had not respected the almshouses. After the First World War, road widening schemes were proposed, which of course included demolishing the almshouses and replacing them with something nice and modern. The House of Lords intervened, listed them as Grade 1, and in 1923 prevented their demolition. But at the same time, Croydon had been chosen as the site for London's airport, a couple of miles southwest from here. This further increased the traffic. New roads were built around the airport, but traffic from London still had to get to them through Croydon, past the almshouses. Buses and cars got larger. Trams were confined to their tracks and did not help anything. And even though the airport closed and was replaced by Heathrow, something had to be done. The almshouses had to go. And as you see on the right, you really can see how the road narrows, and it's really exemplified by the center line, which does this great cross here. And they're also sticking out, as I say, into this cross street. So, sorry, they're in the way. But then in the 1950s, planners realized that a couple of miles north, there was a road link to the wide roads built for the airport. And so the Croydon Bypass was created out of already existing roads. Now the A23 turns right and goes to Gatwick Airport in Brighton, and the A235 goes straight on to the almshouses, which are saved again. 30 years later, there were more problems. Traffic was heavier, vehicles larger, The intersection was a bottleneck. The almshouses had to go. But suddenly, planners realized that the parallel road to the east was wide and had sidewalks, wide sidewalks, and could be developed. Through traffic was now routed to the east, and unbelievably, Croydon suddenly had an underpass, so that traffic went through the town under a busy intersection and hardly ever had to stop. And more. This traffic was then carried over the old Brighton Road by an overpass and soon arrived at the bypass created 30 years before. The almshouses were safe for another few years. Traffic increased. The European Union brought European-sized trucks known as juggernauts to England. They clipped bricks off of buildings on sharp corners, and it was all too much for the authorities. And the almshouses would have to go. But salvation was at hand, and no doubt Whitgift turned in his grave. The concept of pedestrian malls had arrived. And so today, the almshouses are still where they were 424 years ago, at the end of a very nice, long, green mall. You see in this one, again, the beginning of the green, but you see how they do stick out well into the roadway. This is a new tram track which has been built, and you can see how it has to curve to get around them. So is this the end of the story? Ask me sometime. A short and probably successful story from the United States. Hot Springs, Arkansas became a go-to destination in the mid-19th century because of its allegedly therapeutic hot springs. Clients could also buy good food and increasingly illegal alcohol, gambling, and prostitution, all to tempt them there. It was a haven for New York and Chicago gangsters in the first half of the 20th century. Politics became amazingly corrupt to keep it all going. Shootings and bombings of the places of entertainment became increasingly common. Then Nevada started to provide all that hot springs had, but legally. Attorney General Robert Kennedy decided to clean America up, and soon only one establishment was left: Vapors, high class in all respects. But all knew what happened behind the closed doors off of the dining room. Finally, it was closed. What happened to this white elephant? It became a church, the Tower of Strength Ministries. Back to England. In 1923, a 70-foot high water tower, where the arrow is, was built in Thorpeness, Suffolk, on the top of a hill. It was very necessary for providing water to the village, but it really destroyed scenic views from all around. You know what water towers are like, and with a big metal tank on top. So a false cottage was built around the tank, which, at least from a distance, alleviated the landscape. For miles around, you could see what appeared to be a cottage poking up through the trees. And when the water tower became redundant, it was turned into a rental cottage, which you can still go and spend a night or a week or whatever you want there. And notice at the bottom, we finally have Scott's red phone box. And finally, a real elephant, though not white. Built in 1881 in Margate, New Jersey, probably on a whim, Lucy, as well as being a landmark for sailors, became in turn a tavern, part of a rooming house, a beer garden, a hotel, and a museum, and a National Historic Landmark. She is 40 foot tall with an 18-foot howdah on her back, and so beloved by locals and visitors that when she was threatened by developers, she had to be moved. And we see in the lower two images her being moved through town. Now she's used for birthday parties, Valentine get-togethers, and as an Airbnb rental. You enter through one leg, exit through another. For 140 years, she has adapted to changing times, just as we can. So thank you, and keep on adapting.
That's great. Thank you very much, Peter, for that, for some terrific slides there.